I am pleased to introduce John McKnight, co-founder of our ABCD Institute here in Chicago, and Cormac Russell, founding director of Nurture Development in Dublin, Ireland. And I'm going to pass it on to John.
Well, a wonderful gathering of people, and I'm sure some that we have known from the past, and we may be a little repetitive for that reason because we want to have everybody have a sort of a full sense of what's in the book. Now, the book is called The Connected Community. Another way of looking at it, though, is that it's a book about neighborhoods, but neighborhoods thought in a little different way. Neighborhoods that are thought of as magical places, the many mysterious places, places of great adventure. But most of us don't think about neighborhoods that way. And so I think this book is sort of a guide to opening our eyes to what's there. And I know that for years I never had open eyes as to what was in the neighborhood where I was. And I learned how little I saw in the place I was in Ireland, where Cormac comes from. In Ireland, my wife and I went to a little town in the west, had 20 houses, I think, one store, one church, and farms around it. And outside of the town was a lake. And I love to fish, always carry a rod and reel with me, a collapsible rod. And so I decided it'd be wonderful to fish. And I went to the local store because I didn't have any bait. And I walked up a little path into the store, and the store was pretty small. Old Irish gentleman was there. And I said to him, "Sir, I'd love to fish in that lake." I said, "Do you have any bait?" And that stopped him for some reason. And I said to him, "Well," he said, he said to me, "What do you mean bait?" And I said, "Worms be good." And he looked at me in the strangest way. And he said, "Sonny, you walked in my path, and there are 3 big stones on either side of the path. And if you just go out there and turn the stone over, you'll find what you're looking for. They all have worms under them." And I felt so foolish because instead of looking at the place where I was for what I needed, I thought I had to buy what I needed. Right? And so that opened my eyes to the fact that the neighborhood is the same kind of a place. It's a place that has so much to offer. And I I had another experience that led to this book. And that was that one of my colleagues, I started out as a neighborhood organizer, but I went to a university in the latter part of my career. And my chief colleague there was a man named Jody Kretzman. I know that some of you know him, and it's with deep sorrow that I have to say that my chief colleague over the years passed on. And we had his funeral on Saturday. But he was a wonderful guide. And, we both he had been a neighborhood organizer, I had been a neighborhood organizer, and we both went to the university at the same time to a new research institute about cities and their neighborhoods. And what we found was 24 scholars who were doing research about neighborhoods. However, what really struck us both was that all of this research, which they then gave to or sold to social service agencies or government, all of those started with the premise that this place called a neighborhood was filled with problems, with needs, with deficits. And Jody and I thought, but we've been there. And yeah, they got problems like anybody has in neighborhoods that have problems. But they didn't do any research on what it was that people who were there had done with what they had there to make life better. And so we decided that was the piece of research we did. And we went to about 20 cities in North America in neighborhoods and talked with people. We asked them this question: can you tell us what the people have done together here that has made things better? And we collected those stories and found that within the stories, there were things that they used when they made things better rather than turning to a university to figure out how they should be fixed. And so we published a book called Building Communities from the Inside Out. And you may have seen it. About 120,000 of them are out there. And it's a guide, our first guide to what's in the neighborhood. And the book we're talking with you about is really what we've learned in the subsequent 30 years about neighborhoods that can be added to, not replacing what's in the Green Book. And so what we found was we looked at every story that we collected in the neighborhoods after people answered the question. We looked at the story and said, what did they use? We assumed there was something there. It wasn't just a bunch of problems that other people, outsiders, saw. And we concluded, after looking at over 2,000 stories that we collected, that there were 6 basic assets, we call them. You could call them building blocks, or you could call them ingredients. I like building blocks the best. We said assets because we were in the university and we had to pick some words people wouldn't understand. But I think if we'd pick words people would understand, we would have said, well, these are building blocks. And so let me begin us on this journey by going over with you. Some of you, of course, have already known about this. Some of you learned about it. But I think there are a lot of people here who have not understood the particular kinds of assets that we found that people used when they made something better, when they were the producers of their lives and their future. And so there are, and here you might want to show that slide. We thought there were 6 assets, and I have to go over all this pretty quickly, but you can get our book and and it will really open this up much more widely than I can. But the 6 assets, if you look at a story, what did people use? What were the building blocks? There are first, the gifts and the skills of the local residents. Second, the associations, clubs, groups, and organizations that people created in a sense to magnify and connect their own gifts. The third thing that appeared in the stories was very local institutions, a firehouse, hardware store, a YMCA, local institutions. You all know there are three kinds. Traditionally, one is public, one is not-for-profit, and one is for-profit. The fourth thing we found is that there was a great deal of exchange that was of great value that was going on inside the neighborhood. Sharing, trading, connected, buying, selling. The fifth thing is the place itself, we found, was often a valuable building block that people used. And the last one we found was stories, that people use stories about the neighborhood and what it had done as a way of, number one, understanding what they had done. It was like a library of learnings about how we made this a better neighborhood, those stories. And those stories also, I think, become the basis for culture. Every culture has its stories which carry the learnings through time, right? And so those are the five basic assets, we would call them, which people used when they made things better. Well, then let me say a few words about those six basic building blocks that might make them even more visible. The first is that everybody in a neighborhood has abilities, gifts, and skills. And we found that there are, are 4 questions that if you ask them of anybody in a neighborhood, you will make a major discovery. And the 4 questions are, can you tell us what are your most significant gifts? And by that, I mean what you're born with. What is your natural talent? The second question is, what we would like to know also is, what are the things you have learned, not that you were born with, that you have learned, that are most significant in your mind? The third one is, what are your passions? And your passions are so important because passions are interests that become action. And this is one way of finding out what people care most about is, what are their passions? What are their actions? And the next question is, what do you know that you know well enough that you could share it with other people on the block, and especially share it with the local children? So that's the first asset. And you got a treasure chest in your block, I can assure you, or in your building if you live in an apartment. If those 4 questions plus others, of course, can open up an understanding of the possibilities for building things, because you'll find that people just have so many gifts that you can hardly believe it. In fact, we've run into a situation a lot of times where people find out what capacities people have on a block, and there's so many, they say it's so hard to see where we're going to start because it's so rich here. It was here all the time, but we just didn't happen to see it. The second asset is that people in the neighborhood get together into groups, into organizations, into clubs, into gatherings, and we call those associations. And why they do that? Well, they do it, number one, because sitting there with a capacity, gift, or passion and not sharing it is frustrating. And so associations get built because people have capacities, gifts, and interests that they want to enjoy more for themselves and to share with other people. So associations are the way people bring their natural capacities together, and together that becomes a set of building blocks for shaping their future. And there are all kinds of associations people belong to in all kinds of neighborhoods. And we've got lots of examples of those associations in this book. So that's one of its features. The third asset or building block is the local institutions. And those institutions might be a fire station, might be a hardware store, might be a YMCA, but they're local. They're within the capacities and control of local people. Now, you all know there are three kinds of institutions classically. One is those that are government. Second, those that are business. Third, those that are not for profit. And what we have learned, and I think want to make especially clear here, is the difference between associations and institutions. Can you show that slide? And this is a summary of the difference and why we would never say organization. We would say there are paid groups of people in institutions like that who are the hammer, right? And there are groups of people together, and they are like a circle. One's circular, the other's hierarchical. Each has its place, but we find that when you get in trouble, it's because you don't know which of those two is appropriate to get the job done you want. And so just very briefly, hierarchies, almost all institutions are built as hierarchies. And they are like a hammer. They are not like a saw, or they're not like an association. They are distinctive institutions, and they're built for a few people to control many people. Their purpose is to produce goods and services. They create clients and consumers, and they need needs for survival. But associations are different. They give you all kinds of choices rather than the decisions of somebody above you. They create care. They don't have money to produce goods, but they are the main sources of care in a neighborhood. And the name of the people who do this in the associational world is not clients, it is citizens. And finally, they need capacities, not needs. They need people who are producers, not consumers. So, very important, do you know the difference between an association and an institution? And why? Because they each have unique capacities. And if you don't know the capacities of associations, nothing on an institution in an institution can do the job. You can never hire enough police to be safe. But we know that associations and associational life on a block or a neighborhood scientifically, over and over, it comes out. The associations and the relationships people build from them lead to much more security than the police can ever provide. The fourth asset is, I'm sorry, fourth asset is exchange. That is, people are trading, sharing, giving, and buying and selling. And that exchange is an asset if you can keep it happening within the neighborhood, not that your resources are always going outside. And the sixth is stories. And I already mentioned the significance of stories. They are the library of what we've done, and you can find there the building blocks of how we have done it. So those are the six basic assets.
Evening, everybody. So it's 2023, really big year for folks passionate about community. So it's the 30th anniversary of the Green Book, and it's the 50th anniversary of E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, published in 1973. So a big year, lots to be hopeful for, despite what the media are telling us. There is still cause for hope, and it's on us. So that's both exciting and overwhelming somewhat. So I thought I'd start taking John, the idea there, we've lost John, he'll be back in a moment, but the idea was tonight that we'd talk about two features in the book. So one is the idea of the assets. And about 30 years ago, that was really emphasized. This idea, it was an important story to remind people that we have something worthwhile. We are worthwhile. We are not just the sum of our needs. We're also needed, and we have what we need to be useful, right? So that's an important message, I think, and that's held ground over 30 years. In this new book, what we're emphasizing is that while it's really important to know what you have, you must also know why you want to use what you have in order to create a regenerative, a thriving community. And that's really critical, because what that says is you've got to have a why as well as a what. You've got to have a vision that is directing you collectively as a community towards where you want to go. And then that from there makes sense of why we would go and look for our resources, our building blocks, or our assets. So that kind of simple idea of you say to somebody, so what do you care about enough to take action on? And if three of your neighbors helped you, what would you love to do around here? I think that's a much better starting point than tell us what assets you have in the neighborhood, right? So we count up all the things we have, and then everybody looks at everybody else and goes, now what? So we have to have a sense of purpose, a sense of motivation. And another way of thinking about that, which I think is what we're trying to work through in the book, is what's the work that we have collectively to do? What is our purpose? Or another word for that would be, what is our function that together we can take on in this or on this canvas called the neighborhood? And what is it that is unique about this work? It's work that we won't necessarily do as a family in isolation from other families in the neighborhood, or do in institutions like our workplace, or even do among circles of friends. So thinking about that question of what are our neighborhoods for, in the sense of our associations in relationship with all of these different features that John has been talking about. And our working answer to that is that there are 7 unique and essential functions for a good life, a satisfying life, ground up. And these functions are absolutely irreplaceable. There is no outside agency that can come in and in a satisfying, enduring, and beautiful, joyful way do these things better than we can. There's counterfeit versions of it. Boy, is there lots of those, but none of them will lead to something that will be joyful for us collectively and will be sustainable for our planet. So I want to speak about those 7 functions in a moment. But just to get into the spirit of that, I want to tell a story. And this story, I think, encapsulates the 7 functions and how these functions are braided together. They're interwoven and storied functions. They speak to each other. They dance with each other. And so the story is actually set in a neighborhood of Voorstad, which is in Deventer in the Netherlands. And the story centers around 2 men. 2 men sitting outside the front of their house in their neighborhood in Voorstad. And they're sitting on their deck chairs, and one turns to another. Patrick and Lennart are their names. And Patrick says to Lennart, you know, this whole environment is too harsh. There are too many bricks. There's bricks everywhere. There's bricks on our houses. There's bricks on our sidewalks. There's bricks on the street. There's bricks everywhere. But there's nothing that softens the environment. There's very little flowers or, you know, greenery or verges, nothing, just bricks. So Lennart is kind of totally in agreement with Patrick. And he says, well, why don't we do something about that? And Patrick says to Lennart, but what can we do? So they both decide that what they do is they'll go into their houses and bring pickaxes and shovels out and start. This is, of course, completely illegal. I'm not giving you any advice on placemaking here, so please don't take this literally. Do not try this at home. But they come out, they start digging the bricks out of their street, and they create little mini gardens. So they kind of turn the bricks up on their side and basically create little flower boxes, put some compost in and put some flowers in. Over the course of a couple of days, their neighbors are walking by, and, you know, Patrick and Lennart are sitting very proudly by their flower boxes, and they're getting lots of compliments. And they're helpful kind of guys. They want to be useful in their neighborhood. So they start offering their neighbors free labor. They say, hey, you like this? We can do one for you. And within about a week and a half, there's about 20, 30 of these popping up on the street, you know, left and right across the street on their side as well. And over the course of a few weeks, this starts to spread like a positive virus, and people are hearing about this idea and even trying it out themselves. So Patrick and Lennart start mentoring other people on other streets and doing this. And one day, while they're mentoring somebody on a few streets, a couple of blocks away from their houses, they meet a lady who's knitting outside of her house, and they start chatting with her, and they say, hey, you know, we know of a knit and natter group. It's a group of people who enjoy knitting, and they're trying to set a Guinness Book World Record for the longest scarf ever knit in one neighborhood. And they're aiming for a 3-kilometer long scarf. And I see, Sandra, you're knitting there as we're talking. So this is perfect, right? couldn't have set this up better. And the idea would be that they would wrap the scarf around every lamp post in the neighborhood and completely surround the neighborhood to the colors of their local community soccer team. It's one of the few, it's not the only, it's one of the few actual neighborhood owned soccer teams in Europe that are still left. Most of the soccer teams now have been commercialized, but this one still remains definitively owned by the local community. Barcelona is another one, but it's a bit bigger. Anybody who knows anything about soccer will know what I mean. So they're very, very proud of this football club, this soccer club called Go Ahead Eagles. And so they're knitting with those colors. So the lady who was knitting on her own joins in with this group. And this is kind of like a micro story within the bigger story, because a couple of days later, they then meet a number of parents who complain that in this neighborhood, there's not a lot for smaller children to do. There's no safe spaces for them to play. What's really striking about Patrick and Lennart is they're people who tend to motivate their neighbors. They're kind of get up and go people. So whenever their neighbor says, well, this is a problem or I'm lonely, they have this impulse to connect them and also to encourage them to try to be proactive in responding to the issue. So when they hear that the parents are worried that there's nothing for their kids to do, they connect them into allotments, and they actually start the process of by hand building play groups and play areas, and responding in that way over the course of about 3-4 months. They've created all of these little micro initiatives that are completely led by local people, simply by connecting people, like John was talking about a few moments ago, by their gifts, their interests, or even their concerns, to different assets in the local community. It may be the built-in natural environment, it may be an association, it may in some cases be a local institution that creates some access or a meeting place. But in all kinds of ways, what they were doing was, in effect, weaving the neighborhood together. So after about 4 months of this, the Go Ahead Eagles, the football club, who have their own stadium, reach out to Patrick and Leonard, and they say, you know, how many of these associations, clubs and groups and initiatives do you think that you've either helped start up or you've encountered? And by that point, Patrick and Leonard had lost count. They just simply didn't know anymore. There were hundreds of these. New connections forming, new initiatives emerging, and in all kinds of ways, almost like a wovenness, an interwovenness of all kinds of different relationships were emerging. So the Go Ahead Eagles said, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we send out a message to all of the associations and all of the people that you have met over the course of the last 4 months and invite them into a community conversation? They can come, we can spend the day together, have some nice food, and have a conversation about the future. This was 2015, when the Syrian crisis was at its height and people were fleeing the war in Syria and were coming to Europe looking for refuge. And this community, the Voorstad community, was one of the communities that the Dutch government said was a community that would be a host community for families from Syria. One of the things that people mentioned that day when they all got together at the Go Ahead Eagles football stadium was that they were quite concerned by what they'd seen in other neighborhoods, where expressions of hate crime and racism was being, engaged in other neighborhoods in relation to Syrian refugees who were coming into the communities, families coming in. So they wanted to do something that sent a message to those families and sent a message to the world that Voorstad, this neighborhood in Deventer in the Netherlands in Europe, was a neighborhood that had a welcome for the stranger at the edge, that it was a neighborhood that had confidence, that because it had managed to weave and connect its associations, its built environment, the gifts of individuals, the assets that John had talked about already, that it had a space and a welcome for those who were at the edge. And so what they did as an outward expression of that welcome was they knit another scarf, which they wrapped around the houses of the families that were coming to live. As an expression in the Netherlands, in Dutch, there's a word called gezellig, which means warmth or welcome or homeliness. And they wanted to send out a message that says, around here, we don't just say we're inclusive, we show it. And so I love that story because in all kinds of ways, I think in that story are the 7 functions that we talk about in the book. It's a story with many micro stories and twists and turns that give us a sense of why the canvas of the neighborhood is such a rich canvas. So let me show you these 7 functions that we talk about in the book. And I think you can see that from the story, that in all kinds of ways, you can see the functions at play. So we know that 85% of what determines our health is our own agency, the extent to which we're in association with other people. You know, if you're not a member of any club or group or association and you join one, you reduce the possibility of dying statistically in the next year by 50%. There's no pharmacological intervention that's better for your health in that sense than community. Also in this community, because there was such a level of interconnectedness, they were increasing security. Because the two primary drivers of security at a neighborhood level are how many neighbors you know by first name and how often you're doing things in the built environment. And you could see in this story all of the different ways that communities were getting to know each other by first name, neighbors, but also doing things collectively in the neighborhood. So, and this wasn't just people who shared the same opinions, but these are people who often had very different opinions, but they agreed that it would be a good idea to knit a scarf or to try to create a playground or to do a mini garden. And so they found in all kinds of ways, despite at maybe a hyper, citywide level, that they were polarized in their opinions. When they actually started doing what they cared about at the neighborhood level, they found common ground. The story is all about the ecology, about caring for the built and natural environment, even if sometimes it was in breach of the bylaws of the municipality. They were still doing things that were bringing greenery and beauty back into what was, in effect, a very harsh environment, and in softening that environment and actually shaping that environment with love themselves. They were creating an ecology which was making them feel better and also showing a responsibility for their natural environment too. So there was a natural positive feedback. The other thing that started to happen in that neighborhood through that story was the patronage of local businesses was increasing, because local businesses were also helping many of these initiatives and contributing and participating. And so what they were able to do was to ensure that a euro that before they started to connect in the way that I described in the story, maybe circulated once around the local economy and then disappeared to a box retail outlet outside of the neighborhood, that same €1 was now circulating 3, 4, 5 times around the neighborhood, because people were being really intentional about how they could make their money stay within the local economy and circulate more often. Also, people really began to think about projects like Incredible Edible. How can we grow our own food so that it's in season, it's nutritious, it's affordable? So local people in the story that I've shared with Patrick and Leonard started to begin to think very deeply about food sovereignty, but also thinking about themselves not just as consumers of food, but as co-producers and co-creators of really, really great food. Now, in this story as well, you hear such beautiful examples, I think, of inviting children not just to play in the playgrounds, but to be involved in all kinds of different ways. And we see this, we all know it takes a village to raise a child, but you've actually got to do the work to create the village within which that can happen. And what's really joyful, I think, about places like Vorstad is that you're also seeing children growing up. And they're seeing a way, they're seeing a culture that says, around here, we welcome people. We welcome the stranger at the edge. We have a seat at the table. We believe in hospitality. And so in many ways, I think the story that I shared that started in that very, very humble conversation that Patrick and Leonard had outside their house was a story about care that effectively permeated the entire neighborhood, and in doing so, took a neighborhood that was very disconnected and brought it together to function like an organism, to function like what you might describe as a tapestry, in a sense. Let me just stop and say, as you have already heard, Kim very kindly introduced me earlier, I'm calling in from Dublin, Ireland. We have lots of traditions that I'm personally very proud of, and I love, and I wish I knew more about. But one of the traditions I'm learning a little bit about recently is lace making, because I'm working with a number of women's groups who are trying to restore the ancient Celtic art of lace making, and initiatives like Toss the Bobbin, which I knew nothing about before about maybe 3 months ago, when I've started listening and learning. So I want to finish my talk by actually just showing you a very short video of a woman who is lace making a tapestry and she's using a technique called toss the bobbin. And the reason I want to show you this is because I think, as well as understanding the relevance of each of the functions that I've just shared with you, we need to think, get our heads around, if you like, get our hearts around how we can, in a way, braid or weave these functions together, because it's in the weaving of the functions into a tapestry that we're actually most likely to create a culture where everybody in the local neighborhood has a real sense that their gift is welcomed and that their contribution is absolutely essential. So let me just show you, maybe just for about 30 seconds before we go to breakout, show you this little video, if I can get it to work. Let's cross our fingers so we get the technology working here. I think this is fun. Thank you for indulging me.
Out the bobbins as I work the trail. I will start with the left side, so I push all of the right bobbins aside, bringing down the left pairs ready to start. As I work, I will toss out 2 bobbins, not 2 together, rather alternate bobbins so that I do not leave a hole in the work. The threads come into the trail on the inner side, so I will toss out from the outer side. Work across and bring in the next inner pair. Tension. Take the second from the left, up, out and back. Take the third from the left, up, out and back. Continue removing bobbins every 2 rows until you have 3 pairs of passives in the trail.
Did you get that? I sat for about 3 hours trying to learn that, and I still ended up my hands really not being very coordinated in the end. But what I love about it is it's a powerful metaphor. It's a metaphor that teaches us, if we think about, oh, hang on, sorry, she's back again. Apologies, it kept playing. But if we think about the functions as like these bobbins, and that what we're trying to do is find ways that these functions can speak to each other. So in the story I shared, you know, it started out talking about street gardens, and then it went into thinking about loneliness, and then connecting with children, and, you know, and reaching out to Syrian refugees. And in a way, it's almost like the tossing of the bobbin. That's what community building is in a neighborhood context. As we wrote the book, The Connected Community, what became really clear to us was that the neighborhood, as a primary unit of change, is like a weaver's loom. It's the perfect threshold or environment within which all kinds of things can happen, where we can get those functions virtuously braiding together and weaving together. But the interesting thing, I think, is you might have the loom of the neighborhood, and we might have all of these different functions, these 7 functions. So you could just imagine that there's lots of people who individually care about caring for children, for example, and lots of others who care about perhaps the environment or health. The exciting part, I think, is when we're all in relationship and finding ways that health feeds into environment, feeds into caring for the children. So these individual functions could be thought of as the threads on the loom. And ultimately, I think the challenge that we're really trying to think about in the connected community is, what can we do to weave those threads into a tapestry? So our work, I think, is the work of tapestry building, because it's the tapestry that ultimately symbolizes and represents culture, the culture of the neighborhood, which has the holding and carrying capacity for the gifts of every individual and has a welcome for all. Because the core message of the tapestry is everybody is in here. So I'll stop there, and I guess what we'd like to do now is turn the floor over to you, and to take a few moments in some small groups to reflect on a question which has been a kind of central question in our work and in the book. So the question we'd like to offer you is here on the slide, and it's an invitation, really, as much as a question, to share a story from your own life experience where local connections, and this is neighbor to neighbor connections in your neighborhood, have made life better directly or indirectly. As you could see in the story, there was a lot of indirect ripple effect in the story. But, for the neighbors that lived there. And what we'd like to emphasize as you share these stories is that really the best stories are the ones that get most neighbors involved. So that's why I share the story from Vorstad, because I think it's an exemplary or a signature story of what happens when you really ripple out and get as many neighbors involved as possible in all kinds of different ways. So take a photograph on your smartphone or take a screen grab so you have a reference point of the question. And what we're going to do next is, I think somebody else has the wherewithal, the technical know-how to put us all into breakouts. So we'll take, how long have we, Kim, in breakout? About 15 minutes? Would that be about right?
Yeah, we have scheduled 20 minutes. I think it'll be between 15 and 20.
Okay. Well, just so people have a sense of predictability, let's just say 17 minutes. So we'll go 17 minutes and enjoy. You'll be in groups of about 3, maybe 4 people. So it'll be a nice intimate space and enjoy each other.
Amanda's going to put us put you all in breakout rooms. I'm going to put this question in the chat, which I do believe you can now see in your breakout room. If as long as I put it in before you go.
I think we're pretty much all back. So welcome back, folks. I was just joking. It's coming on for 1 a.m. in the morning here in Dublin. So it's I can't think of a nicer bunch of people to be with at 1 a.m. in the morning. Just wish we were in a pub somewhere in the west of Ireland, but other than that, it's lovely to be with you. So coming back from that small group conversation, we're curious about what's alive for you in terms of reflections or questions. We have maybe about 10 or 15 minutes, if we push it, left before we close off for this evening. And we do have one question that I want to acknowledge because it was put in the chat, and that's a question from Patrick, which is a question about the optimal scale of a neighborhood. Is there a point past which a neighborhood's too big or before which it's too small to get a kind of a critical mass of energy going? So I'm going to hand over to John. Is that your alarm clock, John? I'm going to hand over to John to pick up that question from Patrick, and that will give you a chance to either put other questions into the chat or to get ready if there's some questions you'd like to vocalize in a few minutes after John has answered Patrick's question. So, John, question of scale in the neighborhood.
Sorry that my computer made me disappear, but it did for half an hour, and I finally got it to come back. At any rate, scale, the size. I think the answer is that in most situations, once you get beyond the place where the number of people can't really know each other by name and by gift, right? It'll force you to hire somebody to make the connection. And while that may be necessary, I think the joint knowledge of everybody's capacities sets scale. That you need to know on your block that Charlie is willing to teach young people how to repair cars. Or you need to know that there's an older woman who has lace that she can make and teach people how to make. And so it's that knowledge that can be connected in a woven way that Cormac showed, that I think defines the best scale. I think you can have a larger scale where somebody has to keep track of the capacities of everybody, and that can work. But the best is no bigger than where we all know what each has to offer. And a friend of mine says that's probably your own walking space. think that way about the locality. It is also true that you can have too few people, because the whole process that we're describing works best if you get a committed group of 4 or 5 people in a local place who are both understanding what people have to offer and making the connections that then result in functions being fulfilled.
Nice. Patrick, did you want to come back at it, on anything in relation to what John has said there?
No, I think that makes good sense.
So there's a connected question then, which is around, can you actually do this from a freestanding start in a brand new neighborhood? And I think that's a great question. Who did that come from? Maybe you could just come in and you might have a context or something that you're particularly working on that you're curious about. It gives us some.
Thank you. That came from me, and I am actually it's a concept that I'm thinking about creating. It would be almost creating like a symbiotic community within an existing community, but the community that I'd be looking to create is one that would really thrive with the methodology that you guys discuss in the ABCD, right? But everywhere in the book, it discusses existing communities and looking for those resources, but can those resources all be brought in and then created within a larger community? And that other question that was asked about the size of the community was a great one, because that was also another part that I was looking at.
Nice. Yeah. And it's really interesting to just think about what we've been saying today in terms of proximity. And obviously, as people are living close by each other, the possibilities of being in relationship with the way we've described open out. And, but your question, I think, is a little bit more about arriving new into a neighborhood for the first time, or preparing the ground for people coming into the neighborhood for the first time. Am I getting that right?
It would really be building from the ground up.
Yeah, fascinating.
But creating it in such a way that it is an asset-based community.
Mm-hmm.
A functioning community that is inclusive as well would have a group of people whose function would be to welcome people to the community, and to have that welcoming a recognition of their gifts plus the traditions and culture of the neighborhood. You're coming into a place that has a way, a special way, a way we've developed out of our own capacities. Welcome. We just can't wait to find out what are the special gifts, capacity, skills, passion, and knowledge that you have. And that's a real welcome. It says, you're valuable. Thanks for coming. You got stuff that'll help make all of our lives better.
And that's really critical as well, because as places get more urbanized, and we also have greater levels of churn. So a lot of major cities now, neighborhood level, are seeing a churn, which means a change in population every 3 to 4 years of as much as 40%. So the ability to welcome people into the neighborhood and to create a reputation that says we are welcoming. We welcome people in, we want people to come and live here, and you'll feel good about living here, and you'll be hosted when you come here, is really, really critical for the very survival of many neighborhoods going forward.
Yeah.
Lots.
You're meeting people at the beginning and saying, we are a we. So when somebody says, where are you from? Or who are you, let's say, you don't answer, well, I live on the 1200 block of Judson. The answer is who I am is a member of the people who are woven together on my block.
Mhm.
That's who I am, right?
It's important to understand the difference between being in a community and being of a community. And it's interesting here, Cheryl, just to invite your voice into the conversation. You're saying you struggle somewhat with the language and the emphasis on place. Can I invite you to vocalize around that so we could get a better sense of your concern?
Sure, thank you. So I attend a lot of these. I'm a community builder. I'm running a time bank. This is my passion. I attend these a lot. And my community is specifically built around caregivers of people with disabilities. So my community here in Massachusetts, and I've built it, you know, we've built it together, and it is very large, it is very close knit. But we are not geographically near each other at all. We're kind of spread all over Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts isn't that big a state, relatively speaking. However, you know, we're a few hours from each other, depending on where we are. But the point being that we're very, very close knit. We are bound and brought together by a whole lot of things that I won't get into, but I love what John said, because it's true. It's for all of us, whenever someone new comes in, our very first response is to make certain that they feel as welcome as they possibly can, because it is inherent in the fact in why we're together, that we share a common bond of struggle as caregivers to people with profound disabilities. And so that's already understood. That already brings in this joy and trepidation and all of those things. So we have a lot of things that already bind us. But also, to your point, when we introduce ourselves, a lot of times we're introducing ourselves in the context of being the mom of, the sister of, and not who we are. Who are you? Well, I'm Nikki's mom, you know. Yeah, but that doesn't mean anything more to me than your address. Who are you? You know what I mean? And okay, you know, so we have a lot, but that's what I was saying, is that oftentimes when I join these kinds of conversations, the questions feel like they're really related to the geography of a community, you know, a geographic base, and that's just not where I am. And I can't imagine that I'm alone in that. So that's where I come from.
Yeah, yeah. John, do you want to pick up on that, and then I'll say a word or two as well?
I think that I've had a lot of chance to see people who are dealing with people who have, quote, disabilities, unquote. And over again, the question is, how do these folks get connected? And the connecting process that you see that works takes a piece of ABCD, the first piece, and says relentlessly, what does this person have to offer? What do they want to offer? And the introduction to community is effective when the person you want to have introduced is showing that they have something that they can contribute. And incidentally, there is in Canada a city that works on this principle, and it's called Prince George. And you might look at Project Friendship, because they have a group of citizens who say, how can we connect people in their neighborhoods? We connect them because we know what they offer, but they're disabled. Nonsense. we know much more about them than their empty half. Cormac, you.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I feel very strongly about, Cheryl, is living with my brother Kevin, who is labeled with an intellectual disability. Is he's got multiple expressions of community in his life. So some of what community is for him is connections around other folks who have a solidarity around his struggle. And I think that's a really important ennobling feature in his life. It matters hugely. But I think he also has many other expressions. So he loves music, and he's got people that he associates around music with. And he's also deeply connected in the place that he lives in. And I actually don't think it should be either or. I think it should be a range of possibilities, that there's a range of entry points to a good life. And I think it's difficult when we start talking about place, because of course it might sound as if we are in a way dissing affinity groups, or groups that are particularly working on issues of solidarity or exclusion, and we're not. But what we are saying, because actually there's hundreds of definitions of community, in the sense community is whatever you say it is, because it's a verb, not a noun. We live it, we do it. It's an experience. But I do think it's worth emphasizing that for those who've been pushed to the edge, that there are great possibilities for inclusion in neighborhoods if the neighborhood can figure out how to create a culture that says everybody here is in. And I think, as a brother, that would be incredibly nourishing for me. Both my parents are deceased now, but I think it made a massive issue for their end of life journey, knowing that Kevin wasn't just connected to a group of a community that had the same lived experience around disability or solidarity around that, but also many, many others. And actually it's his neighbors that had made the biggest difference to him on a day-to-day basis after mom and dad died, with respect, not the people in his affinity group, which he meets maybe once, twice a week.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you. I appreciate all of that so much. And by the way, I'll be in Dublin the 6th to the 12th of May. So I will come and I'll reach out to you and we'll go to a pub.
Please do.
Right.
Any last burning questions before I hand over to Kim to close us out?
I have a question. We're currently work out of West Virginia, and hi, John, and it's a struggle. The family units have been destroyed. In essence, 60% of our counties don't live with their parents. So when kids are aging out of the foster care system, many of them are leaving with absolutely no sense of family or connectedness. And so there's a lot of discussion around the need for permanence in young people's lives. So I'm just trying to figure out, people that are most disconnected from community life, and what to do about how to get young people at that age connected in some community where they're going to have to live out their lives.
That's how I started my career. But before I answer that, and this will probably be the last question that we'll respond to tonight, and then hand over to Kim to close. John, do you want to say anything in response to that question?
No, you go ahead, because you have the experience.
Well, my whole journey into ABCD started around this question. And in Ireland, a lot of the work that I did in the early 90s was involved in shutting down very big religious institutions with other people, obviously, and moving into what we call community care. And it really struck me that there was neither community nor care in what we were doing. We were taking people out of big institutions and putting them in smaller institutions. They just happened to be houses in neighborhoods. They were not community, and they were not care. Despite the best efforts, by the way, of a lot of people like me who were, overqualified and underexperienced. But what we could not produce in the form of a service was care or community. Because you can't, that's not a service, right? So That's one issue. The other issue is, it was pretty clear to me that the community folks, both from the neighborhoods that we were taking these kids from, which was an absolute rupture in their lives emotionally, which it haunted them right into their adult lives. And you could see it in mental health, physical health, and all sorts of outcomes, including morbidity. So it's shocking the damage we do when we take children away from families. It really is. It has to be absolutely the last resort. And in some communities, some countries, it's become the first port of call. But how so many of those communities, both from where they came and the communities from which we landed them into, really believed they had no role to play in those kids' lives. That this was professional work for these kids that nobody could handle, nobody could manage. And, you know, you had to be paid, you had to be qualified. It was very complex work. And so you had a retreat on the part of the community. A lot of professionals who really could not give these kids what they genuinely needed, which was a place where they were needed. And the system, I think everywhere I go, this system has hit the limits of its capacity because it cannot do what it is promising to do, which is create community care, because that's what we call these systems. So I think we need to move into recognizing that actually the therapeutic models that we use, which is largely the methods that we've used. I'm trained myself as a clinical psychologist and realized that I trained in the wrong career. What we had to do is actually move into learning how to do community work. And we fired an awful lot of the social workers, psychologists, clinicians, and said, we got to get people who know how to actually build relationships in the neighborhood. It's a longer term question. We're doing some work at the moment with a number of really interesting initiatives in the US, like Seeing Families, Finding Families Initiative. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but their work, it's very much a social justice piece. One part of it is saying that our institutions are rupturing and causing huge harm to the cultural integrity of families and communities. And that's a social justice issue, which is about professional dominance and overreach. We need to do something to push back against that. But in order to do that, we need to create a community alternative. You know, I would commend to you learning from the work of Jerome Miller and the Massachusetts experiment. He offers a masterclass from the 70s in this idea that if you want to deinstitutionalize people's lives, you've got to recommunalize their lives. You can't push back against the institution unless you're creating a meaningful community alternative. And most of foster care and childcare services have no community building component to them. There is no there. And that's the piece we need to put right.
Very helpful. All right, I'll look up Jerome Miller. Thank you.
Good, you're welcome. Kim, over to you to close us out.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us and for your participation in the discussions and everything that went on tonight's event. So if you haven't read it yet, The Connected Community, it can be found online. We would like to recommend ABE Books. They are a national coalition of small book sellers, and they're located, they're online. I just put the link in the chat, but we always like to support the small book sellers. So just thank you very much. And again, if you have some questions and want me, either email Cormac directly or you can pass them on to me and I will pass them on to Cormac. But have a great evening. That was wonderful to see you all tonight. Thanks very much.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, friends. Go well. Have a good evening.